There are some briefer passages towards the end of the chapter about language and cognition and allusions to neuroscience. One semi-rhetorical question would be, are language and other processes related or independent? Now, you might remember John B. Watson from the earlier part of the semester. He would say that thought is language, and he wasn't really very given to talking about internal processes. But there are two hypotheses I just want to share. The modularity hypothesis: language is isolated as its own process. It's an informationally encapsulated process. And you could argue that this sort of makes sense. Let me just read a couple of sentences from here instead of capturing so much. But basically, it operates, what we mean by informationally encapsulated, it operates independently of the beliefs and other information available to that processor. Another way of explaining this is to say that informationally encapsulated process operates relatively independently of other processes. And basically, these are things that are almost reflexive in nature, as Fodor says. So the modularity hypothesis then argues that certain perceptual and language processes are modules. In other words, they stand alone. These processes are thought to be set apart from other cognitive processes such as memory, attention, etc. So it's its own, I guess you could say, division of labor in the brain. Now, the Whorfian hypothesis says that language directs and constrains thought and how one perceives the world. There's a motivational speaker out there, Tony Robbins, you may have heard of, that subscribes to this. He says that when you assign catastrophic language to something, you frame it later as being catastrophic. So if you're devastated by something, if you're crushed by something, you'll think of it that way in those terms. On the other hand, if you say, well, I'm annoyed by something, that reframes it in a way that is less consequential. So this Whorfian hypothesis, language directs and constrains thought, but it's kind of equivocal. In other words, it's not very convincing. Evidence that language constrains how colors are recognized is kind of equivocal. It really didn't resolve the argument very firmly, as your text describes. And evidence that Chinese speakers cannot produce a counterfactual. Counterfactual is this idea of weighing something that would go against the argument that you're speaking of. So they had this theory that Chinese people, or the Chinese language, I should say, doesn't have that capacity, but when they were slightly trained on it or they made some adjustments, that also tended to not support the Whorfian hypothesis. So of these two, the modularity hypothesis and the Whorfian, you could argue that the modularity hypothesis is more self-evident, kind of, sort of. Certainly Noam Chomsky would have endorsed it. But the Whorfian is one that seems appealing on the surface, but didn't have the same evidence.